All right. Okay, so Brittany's not here. You were in announcements. That, no, that's the participation. Yeah. All right. So when you're TA input analysis, you're my TA for life. You don't get out of it. Anyway. Okay. So I just want to remind you guys of a few things. I know I talked about this at the beginning of the semester. So I'll be teaching next week in person, but then the week after, please note that we will be live on Zoom. So I'll be 7 hours ahead of you, but I'll stay up and alert and teach you in person from Europe. And then the week after, I will be in a workshop, so I can't get out of that. So I will record that lecture, so you can listen to it anytime you want, but definitely before your midterm. Because I think, let me pull up the schedule. When do we have your midterm? Let me see, do I have that? Let me open it. I made some edits because we have only 5 presentations. Stay with me, you guys, stay with me. So I made edits because we have 5 presentations instead of 6 presentations. So, oh, why is it too small? Why is it too small? Not too big. Oh. Okay. So we are here. I'm behind like always. Every year I add more information and I always add behind. So we'll have these two, one on over Zoom in person. This is going to be recorded. Oh, I'll be here in person for March 1st. So, and then there you have your spring break, and then the exam. The exam will not cover milk proteins, okay? So the exam will be until we finish the enzymes. So make note of that. So everything until enzymes will be on the midterm, on the first exam. And then the first presentation will be March 22nd. So I need to make adjustments for March 29 because we have the P50 event. So stay tuned. I'll figure this one out. I'll talk to you about an alternative date potentially, because I don't want it to be recorded or via Zoom because we have student presentation. I want it to be live. So I'll work with you to find a different date for that lecture. It will be outside of Tuesday, 29. We'll have to figure out a different date. So stay tuned. So, but the first presentation will be March 22nd. So those of you that selected the protein presentation, that would be your first, that would be your date of your presentation. And then I will confirm I still have one group to select a topic. And once that group selects a topic, then I will finalize the dates for the rest of it. But for sure, those of you that believe the protein saturation will be March 22nd is your presentation. So plan accordingly. Remember that I want to finalize your papers ahead of time. I want to look at a presentation draft a week at least ahead of time, and then you'll find it. Keep in mind I'll be traveling, so the sooner you get started on this, the better to get feedback. Okay. Any questions about schedule? I just want to make sure everybody is up to date on that. And then another thing I want you guys to, not to be shy to interrupt me if I'm going fast. Or if there's something that you need me to explain again. So the thing is, I do get carried away. This is my favorite topic, as you all know. So I have a lot of examples to give you, but often when I give you an example and if I go fast, that means I'm going to come back to it. So I gave you a lot of examples when we were talking about amino acids and the functional groups. I gave you a lot of examples, but a lot of the later parts of the class is going to come back to these examples and solidify it all. However, if you take notes and I'm going fast, say, Sam, can you repeat? Can you slow down? Keep me in check, because like I said, I can be excited and carried away. So don't be shy, and we're here to learn. And like, although more than half of you are in the protein business with me, this is your educational time, and there's no shame in asking questions, and you're here to learn, and I will not think that, oh, we should know this. No, I'm never, ever gonna give you that vibe. Okay, so, all right, let's, just a couple of questions I came up with. I don't want to take a lot of time reviewing everything we covered last time, but I want just to bring back to the concept of the PI and PKAs and all of that. So do you remember, if we have a neutral amino acid, that means the R group does not have an ionizable group, does not have a third PKA. How do we calculate the PI of a neutral amino acid? Try not to look at your notes, try to remember. Do you remember, E?
Is it PKA1?
Yes. So that's exactly it. So PKA1, so the PKA of your carboxyl group plus the PKA of the amine group, you divide by 2, you get the PI. That's for a neutral amino acid. If you have an acidic amino acid, what? Yes.
You take the PKA of the acidic group plus the PKA of the alcohol.
Yes. Exactly. So that would be your carboxyl group PKA plus the PKA of the carboxyl group in your R chain divided by 2, you get the isoelectric point, and the basic, easy. So Saru, you want to say?
Amine group, like it's the same content. Amine group on like in your protein, and then amine group in the R chain.
Yeah. Amine group in your amino acids. So the regular amine group that is bonded to the chiral carbon, and then your PKA of the amine group is an R chain, and that's divided by 2. Good. And then another thing we talked about is that basic amino acids will have higher PKA than acidic. Therefore, the isoelectric point for basic amino acid will be higher than the isoelectric point of amino acids that are acidic. And same for a whole protein. So you want to think about, okay, so these are amino acids, and then there are a lot of calculations to get the PK, the isoelectric point of the protein, which we're not going to go into that. But when you have, sometimes you have a basic protein, that means it has a negative charge above a very high PI. So when you have a basic protein, let's say, let me give you an example of a basic protein, napin. Some of you know napin from camelina and canicus. It's an albumin protein. This is a very basic protein. It really has a high PI, isoelectric point. So it will only be negatively charged above that under very alkaline conditions. That's why some of you that are working with canicus and camelina, you have to solubilize the protein pH 10 and 11 and 12 so that they carry that negative charge so they can be solubilized. So I'm trying to link things together. I'll come back to that concept, but I'm trying to give you examples. When you think about the PI and the charge of the protein above the PI and the charge of the protein below the PI. Above the PI, negatively charged, below the PI, positively charged. And the pKa is the pH where you have 50% of your groups are dissociated. So 50% have protonated or not ionized, and 50% ionized. That's the pKa. PI, you have a net charge of 0. All right, so just keep those concepts going. We'll be talking about that the entire semester, mostly. So just keep those concepts in. So we talked a lot about functional groups in the arcane, and I gave you a lot of examples. And can you start thinking of few functional groups and some reactions? Like one functional group and a potential reaction. OH group. Phosphorylation. Yes. So serine, threonine have OH groups in the arcane. And these can be phosphorylated, glycosylated, and later on, we're going to talk about caseins, and we're going to talk about the phosphorylated caseins and the glycosylated caseins, and then what roles they play in the formation of the casein micelle. I did give you these examples, but I'm going to go back to them when we talk about daily proteins. Another example. And OH groups that is very essential, and sometimes it's frustrating, sometimes it's good, but whatever you wanted to say, go ahead.
I think I was thinking of the or like the green.
Oh yeah, phenolic,
Like, yeah, I think that's what I was talking about. And then I was thinking of how that allows you to see like absorbency at 280.
Yes.
Measure that.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say the ring structures, that of course we have the aromatic, we call them, and then the tyrosine has the phenol where you have the aromatic ring, 6-carbon ring, and an OH group. But then we also have tryptophan, and we have phenylalanine, and they have these aromatic groups that allow the absorption at 280. And we said that all proteins, not peptides, all proteins have a certain amount of these aromatic groups. So all proteins absorb at 280, but not all peptides. So Charu, you're hydrolyzing your protein. So when we're doing size exclusion, we're monitoring at 220. Because that's the 260, 214, 216, 220, 224. You see in literature around that range, peptide bonds absorb less. So when you have a peptide of 4, 5, 6 amino acids, it might not have tyrosine, might not have tryptophan, it might not have phenylalanine, so it won't absorb it to 80. So therefore, we monitor, if we want to do size exclusion and monitor our peptides, we have to use absorption at nanometer 220 nanometer to see these peptides. Okay, that's good. I was thinking of another functional group that sometimes we want it to react, sometimes we don't want it to react. Yes. These groups are so tricky. Sometimes we want them to stabilize our protein, to form disulfide linkages, to form like gluten matrices. So sometimes we want those disulfide groups to have that disulfide enrichment. Sometimes we don't. When we are looking at protein solubility and we are extracting the protein in industry, they heat the protein at high temperature, you end up with not only denaturing your protein, but polymerizing the protein, forming what we call insoluble aggregates. And these insoluble aggregates are not functional. So we don't want that. So the SH group is very important. Sometimes we want it to react, sometimes we don't want it to react. And then we talked a lot about the amine group and how we utilize the amine group for different assays. Talked about the OPA, some of you do that. We talked about degree of hydrolysis. We also use the OPA agent to determine the degree of hydrolysis, meaning how many peptide bonds were broken, because you measure the free amine. So yeah, we gave a lot of examples. Some of these examples will come back. So what do I want you to know from these initial, lectures? You want to know your amino acids. You want to know these functional groups. You want to know what potential reactions these functional groups take part in. And I gave a lot of examples that will come back to us as we, proceed with these lectures. Okay. Any questions? So I ask you questions, you ask.
So
Of course, Gina has a question.
yeah, so you said that this alkyl group, sometimes we don't want it, so how do you prevent it?
How do we prevent it, Gina? Yes, we prevent it in certain way, controlled processing conditions. So if I want to generate, a lot of what we do in our lab is optimized protein extraction, and we scale up in the pilot plant. So when we go to the pilot plant, we have long conversations with Mitch. What do we tell Mitch? Please control the pH here, control the temperature, control the time the protein is staying at a particular temperature. Do we need to evaporate at high temperature? Can we reduce that temperature of evaporation? So control processing conditions to avoid the polymerization you don't want. But sometimes it's not avoidable. So you guys dealing with proteins that are not soluble at alkaline pH, pH 10, pH 11, that's the perfect pH for disulfide interchange. So when you compare alkaline extraction to salt extraction, alkaline extraction, especially for when you have high pH, you produce polymers, insoluble polymers, than when you use salt extraction. So processing conditions. So you want to control your processing conditions to limit disulfide interchange that cause insoluble aggregates and poor functionality. Other questions from previous lectures? No? Okay, if you think of anything, interrupt and don't be shy. All right, so I want to move on now. We talked about amino acids. I want to move on to the formation of the protein structure. So we start off without looking at your notes. What is the structure we call? Don't look at your notes. Yeah, the peptide, do we call it? Huh? Primary. So primary structure is just your sequence. The sequence of amino acids, you form your primary structure. This happens when you have your genetic material, you have your DNA, your messenger RNA, and then your whatever, I don't know all of their names, but that the RNAs are the ones that would put the amino acids in certain sequence based on the genetic information, and you form your primary structure. Then what do we have after the primary structure? Secondary structure. So we have your alpha helix, you have your beta sheet, you have your beta turn, and you have your resonant coil. So these are secondary structures. Then after secondary structure, what do we have? Tertiary. Then your protein stabilizes into a unique tertiary structure. That could be what we're going to talk later on, globular or open structure. We're going to talk about that. So you form your tertiary structure. A lot of proteins just stay as monomers in the tertiary structure. But some proteins form quaternary structure. And this is often found when you have high surface hydrophobicity. So when you have high surface hydrophobicity on your globular protein, so for example, this here, the red, the darker the color, the more the hydrophobicity. I didn't put that up here, but you will have high hydrophobicity, don't like, the protein doesn't like contact with water. So it starts to stabilize itself and form the lowest free energy. You don't want to have a lot of free energy. I'm going to talk about free energy. So the protein, to stabilize itself and hide from water, it starts associating in a more stable form. So we'll learn about different proteins and their different association. An example is spacing in one cell. An example is in soy protein, you have the glycine structure. In camelina penetration and the fusiform, they all form like hexamers or trimers, and stabilize themselves in a quaternary structure. All right. Oh, yes.
So is what companies the data sheet? So which one among those is more stable?
I'm coming to that, but yeah, thank you for the question. Beta sheet is more thermally stable than alpha helix. And we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about each of these structures individually, and we'll talk about their stability. But yes, beta sheet is more, if you have a protein that has more beta sheet than alpha helix, it will have higher denaturation temperature. So your primary structure is your linear sequence of amino acids. It goes to secondary, it's 3D structure where the protein, where the primary structure starts folding, taking shape, stabilizing itself with molecular interactions. And you still have free energy, so more interactions to stabilize itself into a tertiary structure to reduce your free energy into a stable form. And if the protein is yet not stable, has a lot of free energy or have a lot of characteristics that will not allow it to be stable in aqueous, then we form the quaternary structure, which is the association of multiple polypeptide chains. In future lectures, we're going to talk about denaturation. Denaturation can be at any stage of this. So we often call dissociation of the quaternary structure. We don't call it necessarily denaturation, but sometimes when you change the pH or the ionic strength, you destabilize the quaternary structure. So we call it dissociation. And then the tertiary structure can be denatured. We're going to talk about the denaturation of the tertiary structure. It can be denatured by pH, by temperature, by organic solvents. So we're going to talk about denaturing agents. Denaturation can then not only end at tertiary structure, denaturation can also be at secondary structures. So under certain conditions, environmental conditions may induce tertiary structure denaturation and secondary structure. Many of you use FTIR to look at secondary structures, and we'll see that when the protein is denatured, alpha helix relative abundance will reduce, random coil relative abundance will increase, sometimes beta turn increase. We see a lot of beta turn increase in dough formation. And beta sheet will increase as well in some cases. Excessive denaturation, we see all of the ordered secondary structure reduced and random coil increase. So we can have denaturation at the primary state of the protein. So basically when you're breaking peptide bonds, we can break peptide bonds by enzymes. We can break peptide bonds by high alkalinity with temperature or high acidity with temperature, peptide bonds. That's also denaturation at the primary level of your protein. Okay, so denaturation can occur at any of these stages. Excessively denatured protein is a protein that you lost even the primary structure, right? And so there are stages of denaturation. There's partial denaturation, there's complete denaturation, there's denaturation at tertiary, secondary, and primary. So there are different levels of denaturation. And later on, we're going to talk about methods of assessment of denaturation. So we also have a lot of methods to assess denaturation and the extent of denaturation. So keep that in mind. What I want you to learn is an introductory slide. I want you to learn that quaternary structure exists when the tertiary structure by itself is not stable. And also there are different levels of denaturation. We'll talk about denaturation a lot later, but for quaternary structure, we don't necessarily call it denaturation, we call it dissociation. Or any questions? Okay. Stepping into the primary structure, here I'm going to spend a little bit of time on primary structure. What I want you to remember is peptide bonds is essential in forming your primary structure. So the peptide bond is the covalent linkage between the carboxyl group of one amino acid unit, that's an amino acid unit, from amine, carbon, the hydrogen, the R group. And this is another unit, and another unit, amino acid residue. I want to call it, sorry, I don't want to call it unit. I want to call it amino acid residue. One amino acid residue, 2, 3, etc. And what links them is a covalent bond between a carboxyl group of one amino acid and the amine group of another. That's your peptide bond. And terminus, C terminus. Okay, you all know this. It's not new information, but I want you to remember that. Okay, we talked about that the primary sequence is dictated by genetic material. The functionality of the protein, which we will spend a lot of time on, it depends on the composition and sequence. Not only the composition, not only how much hydrophobic groups we have, or how much acidic groups or basic groups, but in what order, because the order dictates also the conformation of the protein, the activity of the different functional group by their exposure to their environment. So what do we have on the surface? We have high hydrophobicity on the surface, that's composition plus sequence, where that amino acid is in the sequence. So that's important to remember. That's why sequence is important. And this is from a nutrition perspective, that essential amino acid is determined by the primary sequence, the composition. Essential amino acid has nothing to do with your sequence, it's just the amount, how much of your essential amino acids are there. Okay. So this is just emphasizing the peptide bond, you want to remember. And I want to also remember that it's the peptide bond formation is what do you call it, condensation reaction. And H2O is released. So every time the peptide bond is formed, one molecule of H2O is released. So it's a condensation covalent reaction. And amino acids, you want to remember approximately, I don't want to remember the actual number, but it's a very small molecular weight. So 135 Dalton. So a dipeptide would be 200 to 250 Dalton. So when you're running, let's say, a size exclusion, and then you see peak, and it tells you it is, if you do the calibration curve and it says this is 180 Dalton, that's not a proton, not even a peptide, because it's less than what you would have as 2 amino acids. So knowing this will help you understand your, for example, your chromatogram and what comes out of it. So try to remember around this is the average molecular weight. So of course, every amino acid has different molecular weight, but this is the average. So when you think about the dipeptide, you want to think, okay, well, how big that is if I only have 2 amino acids. So tell me, what would the linear sequence and the length determines or controls? What does it control or determine?
The structure.
The structure, yes, the configuration. So the sequence, which amino acid come next and so on, determines the conformation, how the protein folds, what kind of intramolecular interactions occur. Yeah, so it determines the configuration, and basically it determines functionality. Why? Because the configuration and how big that molecule will affect is going to be a soluble protein. The larger the protein, the less soluble it's going to be. The more hydrophobic on the surface, the less soluble, but maybe has a good balance of hydrophobic and hydrophilic, then it will be a good emulsifier. So the linear sequence is very, very important. So it's not just the composition, but the sequence dictating the configuration and potentially the functionality of the protein. Okay. All right. I'm going to talk about the bonds and the flexibility of the bonds. Why? You're going to say, why do I care? You care because the flexibility of the bonds impact the configuration of the structure of the protein. So you're going to learn about 3 important bonds, covalent bonds. The first one is your peptide bond. The angle or this bond is referred to as omega. And this particular bond is not flexible. And it's very rigid because it has double bond characteristics. Why? Because this O and this nitrogen at any point in time can share or exchange electrons. If they exchange electrons, this is they're both electronegative atoms. So the electron can go back and forth, and then if this loses an electron and this gives up an electron, then it becomes negatively charged, positively charged, this becomes a double bond. So there is always this interchange between single bond and double bond in nature that makes that bond not flexible and does not rotate. So there is no rotation of the peptide bond. There are 2 other bonds that are important. Why am I talking about rotation? Because the rotation and the flexibility allows the formation of the secondary structure, the alpha helix, the beta sheet, the beta turn. So what allows this bending is the flexibility of specific bonds. The other important bond is, this is your chiral carbon, the central. So the chiral carbon amino acid, its bond to the amine group is pi. And this is psi. So omega, pi, psi, I think that's what they call it, or do they have a different name? That's what I'm remembering they're called. But anyway, so this bond and this bond theoretically have 360 degrees rotational speed, theoretically. So that allows them to rotate, bend, stretch, and form those different folding proteins. Okay. So that's here what I was saying. Theoretically, they have 360 rotational freedom. So the rotational freedom, however, this is theoretical. But it's not really like that. What determines their ability to rotate freely? Or what hinders them from rotating freely? We look at the structure. Which component might prevent 360 degrees rotational freedom.
Electrostatic repulsion or attraction.
What causes electrostatic repulsion? The R group. So the R group, how big the R group is, what functional groups are there. So that basically this R group, that's quite, right. The R group there is what really limits the 360 degrees rotation. In glycine, for example, the smallest amino acid, you have hydrogen for the R group at maximum rotational freedom. So the rotational freedom now affects what? So you want to think about that rotation allows the bending, and then you have the restriction of the R groups. So then when we have this in mind, then we go the rotational freedom affect the folding of the protein, starting with the secondary structure. Yes. So speaking of secondary structure, in this particular amino acid, proline, here it's a cyclic. It's the only amino acid that the R group is covalently linked to your amine group. And then here, we don't have rotational freedom. So this protein, when it's present, I need to stay by the computer because I was told that my voice gets carried away. So when this protein is present in sequence, we call it a secondary structure breaker because it doesn't have the flexibility to fold into an alpha helix or a beta sheet or a beta turn. So wherever you have a lot of protein, the secondary structure is random coil mostly, because it kind of breaks the formation of the structure due to that limited rotation. This is important because later on when I talk about
No, just go back to that probe. Is that because it doesn't have the side group that
it does. So it's side chain. So if you look at the R group, it's right here. So CH2, 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 and this C is covalently linked to this amino. As the only amino acid group, as the only amino acid that its R chain is linked to the amino.
Oh, right.
So that formation gives this bond restricted rotation. So that's why we call it a secondary structure breaker. Later on, so I'm going to give you an example that you will come back later, is with the caseins. Casein has over 18% composition is proline. The amino acid composition of caseins has a lot of proline. So when we look at the secondary structure of caseins, it doesn't have a lot of alpha helix and beta sheets, mostly random coil, and it's an open structure protein. It's not a globular because it's not, the protein is not able to fold on itself. So that's why in milk, caseins are stabilized in my cell because of the extent of surface hydrophobicity of the casein. So they will fall out of solution, so they are stabilized in my cells. And again, I'll talk a lot about that under the daily protein section. But this gives you, link things together in your mind that when you have this amino acid, you don't have that freedom, it impacts how the protein folds. And I go, why do I care about all this? You care because you want to understand how structure impact function and why caseins are natural emulsifiers and why globulin, beta-lactoglobulin is the most soluble protein. So it's all structure-function relationship. All right, now this I will, pay less attention to if I were you, but I just want to tell you so that you know that the configuration, the stable configuration is trans. So you have here alpha carbon, so your R group are not in cis formation, in trans formation. If you have them in cis formation, you have a lot of static hindrance. You have those big groups, big function and functional groups You have a lot of steric hindrance here, and that impacts the stability of the protein and the free energy. So you don't see a lot of cis formation, it's mostly transformation, with the exception of protein, because it's different than all amino acids. When you have protein, you see the configuration a lot in 6 rather than 20. Do I want you to know this information? No, but it's good to know. It's not linked to any particular thing other than you want to know that when I say steric hindrance, you have bulky groups that cause kind of friction, and it's not something that allows molecular interactions or containment of energy. So the stable form in this case is trans because of reducing the steric hindrance. So that's what I want you to take out of this. Okay. Keep me in check. 5 minutes and then a break. All right, 7 minutes. All right. So the peptide bonds, like I told you, it's a very stable covalent bond. So you require high energy to break that bond. It's not an easily, and it's not a reversible bond. You have a lot to put in there to break the bond. So what do I need to break the peptide bond? You need an environment that promotes breaking of that bond. So, no, it's fine. You have a question?
No, I just said acidity, but I just thought loudly.
You thought loudly. Yeah, I love that. Think loudly all the time. What was your thought? You were agreeing with me?
No. Once you asked which environment we need to break the peptide bond, I just immediately said acid.
You were talking with me. That's good. I like that. Another voice in the room. Okay. So yeah, high acidity and high temperature will break your peptide bond. So when we're doing amino acid composition, high acidity, long time, high temperature will break all of your peptide bonds into individual amino acids. Also, high alkalinity will also break peptide bonds at high temperature. The thing is, some amino acids are destroyed at acidic conditions like tryptophan, which is an essential amino acid. So if you want to analyze tryptophan, we cannot use acid hydrolysis to analyze tryptophan. We use base hydrolysis. Also, with acid hydrolysis, we have destruction of cysteine and methionine. And then the 2 other amino acids that are impacted, asparagine and glutamine, will get deaminated to their acidic form, which is glutamic acid and aspartic acid.
Question on this.
Yes.
So for base hydrolysis, like so when we extract protein, for example, and we usually have pH to solubilize it, are we somewhere hydrolyzing with protein?
No, we're not using high temperature.
Okay.
So yeah, so you need temperature, you need energy as well, because it's a covalent linkage. So it's not just high acidity or high alkalinity, but if you leave it at this acidity and alkalinity for a long time, of course it will hydrolyze eventually. The temperature makes it quicker. Yeah. All right, so you can break peptide bonds by proteases, enzymatic cleavages. So we will have a whole, lecture or 2 on enzymes, but here I want to, we will talk about protein modification with enzymes later, but proteases can be very, very specific. So I give you the example of trypsin. So it's a very specific protease that only cleaves after a lysine or arginine. If it recognizes the carboxyl group of lysine and arginine and then cleaves there. So you see here the thin line after the carboxyl group of lysine or arginine. That is the binding site. That's where it fits. It's very, very specific. And it was also an endoprotease. So we'll talk about endoproteases and endoproteases later, but endoproteases goes internally and chops down the protein. Whereas an endoprotease takes one or two amino acids at a time from the extremities. So we have a lot of different enzymes. We have the enzymes are more specific than others. We have pepsin is more a general enzyme, it's a digestive enzyme, but also it might like certain specific amino acids that it would need after. Some are more specific than others, and so on. Okay, so here I want to remind you of two concepts. So the steric strain or strain hindrance, we talked about it briefly, but the proteins transition from linear to folded because of these two phenomena. The steric strain, because if you have two R groups in close proximity, that's not stable, they want to go away from each other. And then you have when the protein peptide is formed, you have a lot of free energy. You can also call it chaos. You have a lot of free energy going on. It's not stable, so the protein folds to contain free energy in bonds. So the free energy becomes contained in bonds. We call that enthalpy. The contained energy. So the change in enthalpy, some of you are familiar with DSC. We can talk about DSC later. You look at something called enthalpy or the delta H, and you might not know what it is, but you know that if it's there, the protein is not denatured. If it's not there, you don't see it, and the protein is denatured. We're going to talk about this a little bit more to explain that. So in order to denature the protein, you want to break bonds. You want to give energy to break the bonds and chaos back. And the enthalpy, and then there will be a change of enthalpy, a change in the contained energy. So we're going to talk about that. All right. So these two phenomena causes the protein to go from primary to secondary to tertiary, and sometimes to quaternary, containing the chaos in stable bonds that contain the energy. When you want to denature the protein, you want to give it energy to break those interactions. So the steric strain is caused by any restriction and rotation caused by the R group. The stretching and bending of the bonds. When you have a lot of free energy, you have the bonds movement, stretching, bending, a lot of chaos. And then the folding contains all of that. Okay. So, and the way the protein folds is to find the most stable form where you don't have steric strain, you don't have functional groups or R chain that are, not liking the proximity of each other. It's not as stable. So the protein starts folding to avoid steric strain, basically. And then this is the concept. Delta G is the change in free energies. Delta H is the change in enthalpy. Delta S is the change in entropy. And I like to call this term the chaos term. So when you contain chaos, this delta G is positive. When you have a lot of free energy and you're breaking bonds, then this becomes negative. As soon as this becomes negative, the protein denatures. Okay, so containment of energy. You want to remember the term enthalpy. You want to remember the term conformation, entropy, or chaos. T is for temperature. We'll get back to these terms a lot. They will come when we talk about miniaturization. So just for now, just remember what they are and what they mean, but then we'll talk about their application and how we use them later. Okay. What's the role of hydrophobicity and water in the folding of the protein? The initial folding of the protein. And stays.
The hydrophilic part of the protein curl up on itself, and then the hydro.
What happens to the water? Yeah, kicked out. Very good. I'll give you a break on this happy thought until, yeah, I mean, 8 minutes break. Till 3:55. You can stay, you can go out, you can stretch, you can dance.
Okay. That's bars. You guys come.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this is that's a sauna. That's not a classroom, layer, it's just hanging. Okay. Oh, actually, we're missing people. Are we missing people? Are you missing a friend next to you? No? Okay, we can get started. All right, so yes, you answered this question. So hydrophobic residues are going to come together, fight from water. And hydrogen bonds that originally happening with water molecule, now no longer happening with water molecule. Water is now kicked to the outside of the interior moiety of the protein. And then you start forming hydrogen bonds instead with the residues within that molecule. So instead of forming hydrogen bonds with water, now you're forming hydrogen bonds with residues intramolecular. So basically, you are starting to form your secondary structure that is stabilized by hydrogen bonds. So if I ask you a question, what drives the formation of secondary protein structure? If you say hydrogen bond, I'm going to say wrong. What drives the structure or the secondary structure formation is hydrophobicity that drives water out and induces hydrogen. Now, if I tell you what stabilizes secondary structure, and if you say hydrophobic residues or hydrophobic interactions, I'm going to say wrong. What stabilizes secondary structure is hydrogen bonding. So, two questions. What induces secondary structure formation is hydrophobic interaction. What stabilizes secondary structures are hydrogen bonding. Questions there? All right. So when secondary structure is formed, other interactions starts happening as well. So you start off with hydrophobic interactions, water goes out, hydrogen bonding starts to happen, but the proximity of different components within these amino acid residues initiates other interactions. You have a lot of free energy and now you want to contain it in bonding. So it's kind of layers. You start hydrophobic interactions, form these hydrogen bondings, you form the secondary structure, and then you have proximity to other functional groups. You form more interactions, you form your tertiary structure that has the least free energy and stable form. So there are a lot of linkages, molecular or intermolecular, intramolecular interactions, within the molecule that happens to stabilize your protein structure. So this diagram kind of summarizes all of different molecular interactions. So you have what we call dipole interactions, dipole-dipole interactions, and also known as van der Waals. So if you hear van der Waals, it's dipole-dipole interaction. They are weak bonds, but additive. There's a lot of them happening between neutral atoms that are in close proximity to each other. So they form an interaction that is very weak, but there's a lot of it within the protein. So weak, but a lot of energy contained that is additive. So it contributes a lot to the stability of the protein by containing energy. So again, it's weak, but additive. Another one is your hydrogen bonds. So this happens between a hydrogen linked to an electronegative atom and another electronegative atom. So you have here O and H between N and H, for example. So a strong electronegative atom with a hydrogen linked to electronegative atom. That's your hydrogen bond. Yeah. So it is mostly involved in the formation of secondary structure, stabilization of secondary structure. So you see a lot of hydrogen bonds in alpha helix structure and beta structure. Okay. And these residues, thymine, serine, aspartic acid, glutamic acid, are among the amino acids that form hydrogen bonds. You don't have to remember. You know, maybe you remember an example, one or two examples. Electrostatic interactions, so negative and positive. These are strong interactions that happen. So they can be attractive or repulsive. So in this case, the attractive forces of help with stabilizing, bringing the structure together. But sometimes, you have repulsion. For example, if you increase the pH a lot, and then you deprotonate and you have a lot of negative charges, that negative charge that causes the protein to swell and unfold. So it plays an important role in stabilization, and if you have light charges, it causes repulsion. So you can say negatively charged groups tend to be not close to each other, away from each other, and those that are positive and negative, they tend to interact. So also they play an important role in the conformation or the configuration of the protein. Oh, and these are examples here of arginine, histidine, lysine, positively charged, carrying a proton. Aspartic acid, glutamic acid, indicating charge. Depending on the pH, tyrosine and cysteine can be negatively charged at a high pH. They can lose their hydrogens at high. Hydrophobic interactions. So you can have those aromatic groups interacting with each other. You have nonpolar, like long chain. Like here, also is a hydrophobic interaction. You have long chain of hydrocarbons. So that is causing hydrophobic interactions, splitting of water. And the last one here is your covalent interaction, the formation of cysteine. So this cysteine and cysteine, or you can say, I don't like this, but cysteine and cysteine. Yeah.
Is this, is the full, is it happening after the like transcription transition?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, post-translational, because when the protein is formed in the cell, you have aqueous. So, and then there's a lot of free energy, and there's hydrophobic groups, there's aqueous, and then the folding starts happening. Post-translational, yes. Okay. Good. So the disulfide linkage contains the most energy. So it requires the highest energy to break. Okay. So proteins that are stabilized, their tertiary structure, they have a lot of disulfide linkages, usually have high denaturation temperature. An example for some of you that might be familiar with, if you look at soy protein, you have the glycine, which has disulfide linkages, and you have the conglycine, does not. So in your thermogram, the peak, endothermic peak for beta-conglycine comes earlier, denatures somewhere between 78, around 82, somewhere around there. And then the glycine denatures higher temperature, 89, 90, because glycine is stabilized by disulfide linkages. So we will talk about thermograms later, but this is just for some of you to be familiar with that. So the more disulfide linkages you have in your tertiary structure or quaternary structure, the higher is the denaturation temperature. This table here is for you to learn, not necessarily the actual number or the distance here, but I want you to know that covalent bond contains the most energy, followed by electrostatic interactions, hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interactions. So this is the energy contained by these types of bonds. Van der Waals is the weakest of them all. So the functional groups in covalent bond, disulfide linkages, the hydrogen bonds, these be those groups that have the electronegative atom and the hydrogen. Electrostatic with those ionizable group, you can add to it the sulfide group and the OH group at high pH. And then the hydrophobic interaction with large, long aliphatic chains or aromatic rings. That's where you have hydrophobic interactions. Okay, so the next thing I want you to learn is this column, which will come back. It's a summary here, but we're going to talk about it a lot in different parts of this class, but this is your summary. Covalent bonds, SS. Most of you know, those of you that run a gel, you know we add ethanol to break down disulfide linkages so that the monomers go through the gel and you can see the monomer. So it breaks the disulfide linkages, DME, DTT, sulfides, free cysteine, which is an amino acid. So you reduce the SS linkages like that. Okay.
So why is cysteine up there? Is it because of all bonds?
Cysteine.
Yeah.
So, good question. Cysteine has a free sulfide group. So when you have SS linkage and you have a free sulfide group, under correct condition, that free sulfide group is going to cause reduction to the disulfide linkage.
But still not.
Steal the electrons. So that are shared. It will break that. That's why it's important to know when you get the term disulfide linkage. That happens when you have three sulfide groups with disulfide linkage. If you don't have a three sulfide group, you don't have a disulfide linkage. That three sulfide group is the initiator of breaking and reformation of disulfide linkage. The concentration that you put of the cysteine is very important because the concentration can break bonds, and if it's really high, you will break bonds and reform them. So you have this concentration effect of the reducing agents that we use. Yeah. Okay. Hydrogen bonds. You use SPS in your sample, right? That's SPS page. So your Lambda buffer contains SPS. What you're breaking here, you're breaking all non-covalent interactions including hydrogen bonds. So detergents, so that you need sodium hydroxide sulfide is a detergent, urea breaks down hydrogen bonds. Guanidine hydrochloride breaks down hydrogen bonds. So detergents and heating. So think about collagen and gelatin. So collagen is a protein, animal protein, stabilized by hydrogen bonds. So when you heat it, the hydrogen bonds are going to break, and then that protein is becoming gelatin. It's becoming soluble, and then when you cool it down, hydrogen bonds are reforming and you form a gel. So it's reversible gel, because when you heat, hydrogen bonds are broken. When you cool, hydrogen bonds are reformed. So the perfect example is collagen into gelatin and that reversible gel, for instance, because gelatin or collagen is mainly stabilized by hydrogen bonds. And we will give example later on with it. So what you want to remember here is heating breaks down hydrogen bonds, cooling stabilizing hydrogen bonds. Electrostatic interactions, so anything that will change the charge. So you add salt or remove salt, you change the pH, you are changing the ionization status of your ionizable groups. So when you increase the pH, this is lost, it loses a proton, so it's no longer positively charged, the amine group, then you have a net negative charge. Then you have repulsion, you lose the electrostatic attractive force. Add salt will shield. So NaCl, sodium will interact with this negative charge, and chloride will interact with positive. So you're shielding charges, so you are interfering with electrostatic interaction. Hydrophobic, again, detergent and organic solvents. So hexane, for example, organic solvent. So instead of the protein being in aqueous, it's now in an organic. So now the hydrophobic groups that are in the inside, now they want to interact with the organic solvent. So the protein will lose hydrophobic interaction within its residue and instead form hydrophobic interaction with the solvent. Keeping, strengthen the hydrophobic interactions. Okay, so it's an important table to know and study. There will be a lot of later examples where you want to know this knowledge. So that's why I highlight this table here. So what this slide talks about is the change in energy that causes denaturation. So D is for denaturation. So what happens here, if delta G is positive, the protein is in its native state. If you break, let's say 1 to 3 hydrogen bonds, that is going to cause a change enough to cause chaos. So once few bonds are broken, then a lot of other bonds, that's like chain reaction. You start with few bonds that gets broken, then the protein has very, very high change in entropy. So more chaos, then you will have an instantaneous negative delta G, your protein denatured. So what I'm saying is as low as 20 to 85 kilojoules per mole is enough to cause chaos. It's enough to increase dramatically your entropy. So few bonds. So 1 to 3 hydrogen bonds is equivalent to 18 kilojoules per mole. If we break 1 to 3 hydrogen bonds, you're already close to causing high entropy and denaturation. So a small change is a chain reaction. It causes a chain reaction of denaturation. So it is enough to destabilize your protein by increasing the free energy, causing conformation of chain. Now, when the protein is denatured, it doesn't mean it has very high free energy, because the protein finds different ways to contain the energy. So you have a change in structure. So you go from native to a denatured state, but the denatured state is already a stable state too. If you unfold, movement happens, the protein reorientates and figures out a way to contain that free energy. So a denatured protein, that doesn't mean it has a lot of energy. It contained it already, but the structure changed. Okay, that's why we go from what we call a native structure to a denatured structure. Both are stable. They figured out a way to be stable. The native is the form, the post-translational. The protein takes a specific form when it's formed within the cell. The denatured protein is another stable structural form, but it formed because of something we did to the environment. We broke some bonds and the protein figured out a way to stabilize itself in a denatured form. Any questions? Okay. So that's what part of what I say when I say found a different way, we call it conformational adaptation to changes in the solution, in the environment. So sometimes the conformational adaptation does not necessarily need complete respiration. Think about enzyme and substrate. So if you want your enzyme to react with your substrate, you need to have it at a certain pH, let's say, or you need to have a specific salt concentration of it. Why? Because you want certain ionization state that suits the best the binding between the enzyme and the substrate. So you want to think about, that interaction. And when you say, why do I want the enzyme at the optimum pH? What does it mean? That optimum pH is making the enzyme in a conformational adaptation to perform its function. And sometimes you want structural stability, which is desired, and that's where disulfide linkages play a role. So in native structure, disulfide linkages, if they exist, like I said, they make the protein more thermally stable. But sometimes we generate large molecular weight aggregates. They're very, very darn stable. Why? Because most of the time, they're not only stabilized by hydrophobic interaction, they are stabilized with the disulfide chain. So once they are formed, they are really, really stable because they form these strong covalent linkages between each other. They became very, very stable. Okay. We'll keep this to next time for now. Okay, so going back to elaborate on the secondary structure now. So this is a form for beta-lactic globulin. We see a lot of beta T, a lot of like structured secondary structure. Something that I will later focus on or mention again is when you have a lot of structured secondary structure, very low random foil, the denaturation temperature is lower than if you have a protein that has a lot of random foil. So keep that in mind. For example, casein can have a lot of random coil. The denaturation of casein is above 130 degrees centigrade. Whereas denaturation of a protein that has a lot of structured secondary structure, like with the alpha helix, denaturation usually temperature is lower. Okay, so here is just identifying the different forms, and now we look deeper into alpha helix. So this is the general sequence to form an alpha helix. So polar, non-polar. P is for polar, N for non-polar. So in order to form an alpha helix, you want a sequence close or similar to this, where you have a polar amino acid, non-polar, followed by two polar amino acids, two non-polar, and the sequence continues. So polar, non-polar, polar, polar, non-polar, non-polar, and then it goes back. So then you form this helical structure that is stabilized by hydrogen bonds parallel to the axis of the helix. So you have hydrogen bonds forming between these residues parallel to the axis. And then you have 3.6 amino acid residue in each turn. That's a college board question. Used to have a very strong college board. I don't know what happened to the college board team. I was the coach, so I no longer have time. So the team is gone, which makes me sad. But this is a very common college board question. How many residues in an alpha helix turn? Why would anyone needs to know this? Why is this important? I can't tell you. I can't tell you, but there it is. It might be a college board question to every college board. 3.6 residues. Why 0.6? Because you have atoms in each of the residues, right? It's the residue is an amino acid that has hydrogen, carbon. So 3.6. Do I say how many atoms? Yeah, 13 atoms. 13. So these 13 atoms is equivalent of 3.6 amino acid residue. Do you need to know this? Not for my class, but for college ball. Okay. No, but I want you to know this sequence. But I don't necessarily remember 2.6 and 13 atoms. Yeah. We go back here to the proline, it disrupt the structure, secondary structure breakers, because it doesn't have that flexibility to allow the bending necessary to form the structure. So when you have high proline, you don't get structured secondary structure. This is beta sheet. So beta sheet, usually you need at least a couple of strands within the protein. So this is not a different molecule. It's the same molecule, but you know the protein folds, and then you have two strands next to each other within that protein. So this belongs to the same protein, so you will have like same protein, then you will have this hydrogen bonding occurring perpendicular to the axis. So instead of like parallel to the axis, you have perpendicular bonding happening. Gives you that beta sheet. Here is, if you remember, polar non-polar sequence of amino acid are more prone to form beta sheet. Okay. And then beta turn. These are segments that literally turn between, most often between beta sheets, you will find a turn. Under certain conditions, beta sheet converts to turn. When the protein is unfolding or refolding, when some of the beta sheets become beta turn. Example, dose formation. So not much, I don't necessarily want to remember that, or for these comments not to memorize, but definitely stabilize by hydrogen bond. And it can happen due to reversal of beta sheet polypeptide. So that's during processing, you can have some reversal of beta sheet, they form beta turn. So here's an example. I just found a better image than you have in your slides for alpha-lactalbumin. Anyway, you have this protein, both are whey protein, alpha-lactalbumin, beta-lactalbumin. Alpha-lactalbumin is mostly, its secondary structure is mostly alpha helix. Whereas in beta sheet, the secondary structure, beta-lactoglobulin, or beta-lactoglobulin, you have a lot of beta sheets. Now, one thing, linking, Anastasia, you asked me this question. So this protein has a lot of more beta sheet than this protein. It denatures at higher temperature. So 75 versus 64. Okay. So this is an indication that beta sheet is more thermally stable than alpha helix. And when the protein denatures and it's starting to refold to form a stable denatured protein, some of your alpha helix are lost and the protein reconfigures and you have more beta sheet that is more thermally stable. So oftentimes when we look at FTIR data, we look at distribution of alpha helix, beta sheet, beta turn, and random coil. One common calculation is alpha helix to beta sheet ratio. When the protein denatures at the secondary stage, you see that there is a reduction in the alpha helix to beta sheet ratio. So when you are doing your characterization of your protein and then you want to understand what that means, you're going to remember that, oh, alpha helix is down, beta sheet probably increased a little bit, but that means denaturation because now my alpha helix to beta sheet ratio went down. So denaturation at the secondary level of the protein. So that's secondary structure. Moving now, the protein is still trying to find the most stable configurations, forms your tertiary structure. And that stabilization is not only by hydrogen bonding, all of the other interactions we talked about. You start containing that free energy, folding and finding interactions that are hydrophobic, that are ionic, disulfide linkages, we have sulfide groups, and ionic interactions. And then you end up with a tertiary structure that is normally quite stable. Unless the protein has a lot of surface hydrophobicity, it has to form quaternary structure. But your tertiary structure is more stable than secondary structure. You contain more energy by forming these bonds. So your free energy now is being contained within these different bonds, forming your stable structure. But we have different types and configuration. So here's your open structure with the casing. That's open structure because of having 18% of its amino acid as protein. So it doesn't form your globular, nice globular structure where you have very ordered secondary structure. You have most of your hydrophobicity is contained in the inside. Of course, you still have some on the outside, but most of it is contained in the inside. You form a nice globular structure. So this secondary globulin is very structurally different than the casing. They would have very different functionality. And that is because of its composition and the formation of the secondary and tertiary structure. Then we have quaternary structures. So we have quaternary structures, like I said, here is an example, a trimer of soy protein trimer. Here you have 3 different monomers represented by 3 different colors. And what happens is because we have a lot of surface hydrophobicity, we associate, form hydrophobic interaction, hydrogen bonding. In some cases, we do disulfide UTG to form a hexamer, and then that will be your stabilized quaternary structure. The casing in my cell is a combination of 4 different types of casings. We're going to talk about that when we cover daily protein. But you have 4 different types of casings interacting. You have here the blue dots are indication of calcium phosphate bridges. You have hydrophobic interaction, calcium phosphate bridges. They are interacting on the surface. You have a lot of the kappa casing that has a tail, or we call it hydrophilic tail, or the para-kappa casing, or the glycosylated portion of that protein is on the surface, giving you charge, stabilizing the whole micelle. It doesn't precipitate. The casing doesn't precipitate, and that forms a colloidal system. So that's one form of quaternary structure. Another form of quaternary structure is your collagen. And so there are strands of the proteins. They're very hydrophilic, so they form strands, and they are stabilized by hydrogen bonding, and that's how sulfide linkages forms your fibrous structure. So this quaternary structure is stable at a particular pH, ionic strength. We're going to talk about each one of those and what would be the stabilizing pH and stabilizing salt concentration to form this quaternary structure that can be destabilized by dissociation when we change the environmental conditions. Okay, so that's basically what is said here. We also have fibrous protein, like I said, the collagen. You have multiple protein strands that, because they're hydrophilic, they are not globular, so they interact with the protein a lot. The surface hydrophilicity is high. So instead of folding like that, they mostly form strands, and they interact with hydrogen bond or disulfide linkages to give you that fibrous protein structure. Whereas other proteins can be globular, like soy protein quaternary structure. In this case, it is the hemoglobin structure. So that's exactly what I said. So they are twisted polypeptide chain, like collagen. Sometimes you have small globular proteins like actin associated, and they form fibrous structures. Usually the function are structural proteins, these fibrous structures. And they're stabilized, like I said, by hydrogen bond and disulfide linkages. Globular proteins, they fold. We have a lot of them, a lot of the enzymes are globular, functional pan proteins are globular, your favorite. So another classification is based on composition. So when we say homoprotein, it doesn't have anything other than amino acids, only amino acid residues. You have proteins that are phosphorylated, like caseins. You have phosphate groups at the serine, thymine residues. You have glycosylated protein like catechosin, but also in soy, for example, beta-conglycine is glycosylated. And having phosphate groups form the phosphate bridges, calcium phosphate bridges, having the glycoproteins, the glycomacropeptide is out there, and carbon stabilization to myself. And then sometimes you have a lipid component, glycoproteins, that helps with emulsification, like in the case of mayonnaise. And the last thing here about the basic structure is every protein has a negative or positive charge. It usually is, like I said earlier, when you go down in the pH, you start having more positive. When you go up above the isoelectric point, you start having negative isoelectric point. You have charges, but they are equal. So that is a neutral or zero net charge. We don't say zero total charge, zero net charge. All your proteins can be charged, but the net charge will be zero at the isoelectric point. So when we increase the pH or decrease the pH, we have like charges, so you enhance the repulsive forces, so you have better solubility. Whereas at close to the isoelectric point, you lose that repulsion. Hydrophobic interactions now dominate. Protein-protein interactions don't have repulsion anymore, and the proteins will precipitate at the isoelectric point. Adding salt, we'll talk more about the fact of adding salt, but adding salt sometimes enhances solubility because it adds a charged load on the surface of the protein, enhancing protein-water interaction. The high concentration of salt kind of shields these charges and competes for water interaction. So it has the opposite effect. And we're going to learn about salting in and salting out. So that is coming. Oh, I have a question here. So at close to neutral pH, what is the net charge of a peptide that has 5 residues of lysine, 4 residues of arginine, 6 residues of aspartic acid, 7 residues of glutamic acid, and 11 residues of lysine? What is the net charge of that polypeptide? In order to know that, what's the lysine carries? What does lysine carry? A positive or a negative charge? At neutral pH. Positive. Arginine carries. Arginine is also basic, so you will remember that. It carries positive at neutral. Aspartic acid and glutamic acid, so carries negative charge at a neutral. Lysine carries neutral charge. So now we have 9 positive, 13 negative, so the total net is -4. So at neutral, this peptide is going to be negatively charged. The net charge is negative charge. All right, so this is, I added this year, again, my former PhD student gave us protein basics class for her company. And she was so happy with her slides. She sent them to me and said, "You're gonna be proud of me." And I said, "Yes, and I'm gonna use them." So, I really liked, because she had only to give like a couple of hours and she needed to make it focus. So she did a lot of summarization of concepts we covered across the entire semester. But I thought it's really great that we have them summarized here because they're gonna come later, and being familiar with some of the descriptors is gonna be very helpful. So, we already talked about kind of, globular, fibrous, flexible structure, like the casein is flexible, but that glycine is not flexible, like the globulin is rigid, not flexible. Because casein doesn't have a lot of disulfide linkages. So it has this flexibility, whereas soy protein, whey protein, they have this rigidity unless we denature them in their structure because they are stabilized by disulfide linkage. So that's what we mean when we say flexible structure, not flexible structure, globular fibers. So we can classify the proteins based on shape. We can classify protein based on solubility. Some of you are doing osmorph fractionation. Some of you also are trying to separate your albumins from globulins because albumins are not functional protein and you want your globulins in your protein isolate. So you separate the water soluble from salt soluble, from alcohol soluble, from acid or base soluble. So understanding how these different fractions of the proteins are different. In plant proteins that are functional, most of the proteins, around 80%, are your globulins. And then we'll talk about that more later on. And then some of you heard of 2S, 7S, 11S, 15S. What is S? You just know it, repeat it, and you don't know what S is. So that is a sedimentation coefficient, and it's correlated to the molecular weight. So here we go. I'm gonna finish that in a few minutes. When does the class end? Now? 45? Oh, I have something. All right, so globular. So you'll have glycine, and this is a primer, but each of these monomers are globular in structure. Beta globulin I showed you earlier, and alpha-galvin are globular. So globulin protein. Flexible open structure. Okay. We're going to talk about how that open flexible structure makes it naturally emulsified. We need flexibility at the interface between oil and aqueous. So we're going to talk a lot about flexibility to enhance emulsification. And then you have this fibrous structure. So, and the folding here, because you have higher hydrophobic amino acid, they get buried on the core. You don't have this high proline concentration like you have in casein. You have a lot of hydrophobicity in casein, but you have that proline that prevents it from forming that globular structure. So you want to differentiate between those. Oh, what did I do? Okay. And that's your osborne fractionation. So you have in all plant proteins, these you have albumins, you have globulins, you have prolamins, and you have glutamins, but they differ in ratio between different types of proteins, sources. So your albumins are water soluble, your globulins are salt soluble. So that's why some of you used to isolate using salt extraction because you want the precipitin, for example, or you want those beta-conglycin and conglycin and glycerin legumes that are all soluble in dilute salt. Prolamins are high in cereals, so you have the prolamins like cornzein and gliadins in wheat, they're soluble in alcohol. Then you have the glutamins that usually have high disulfide linkages, and they're very hard to soluble, they're large molecular weights. So you add acid or base, you add some kind of reducing agent to help get them solubilized them. And glutamin, for example, and sodium glutamin is another example. So here are examples of albumins, globulins, prolamins, and we're going to talk about those different proteins, but that's a great summary to introduce these classes. Now it's the sedimentation factor. So what is the sedimentation factor? So it takes into account when you take the protein in solution, you spin down the protein that precipitate the fastest have the highest sedimentation coefficient. It is in units of time, seconds, but fingers. So the larger the protein is, that means the faster it's going to sediment when you centrifuge or apply centrifugal force. So your 2S versus 11S, the 11S is the higher one of fluid because it will sediment faster, it will have higher sedimentation coefficient than that small molecular weight albumin, let's say, versus napin versus persiferin. Napin is 2S, persiferin is 11S, for example. But we will talk more about those different proteins, but here I want you to remember what that means. But you cannot, it's not an additive. If you have a protein that is 7S and another one, if they are interacting, that doesn't give you 15S. So it's not an additive linear relationship here. So here giving you 2S proteins, albumins. A lot of these albumins are enzymes, enzyme inhibitors. So for example, 15 inhibitor is a 2S. The 7S is beta-glycinin. This forms a trimer. Let's say molecular weight around 150, 180. Glycinin in soy, this forms a hexamer of about what? Over 180, 300? Do you guys remember the hexamer of glycine? Around 250. So very big molecule. So it has this higher, but not double the molecular weight, not necessarily. 15S, it's a combination of like a hexamer with a couple of other monomers interacting and forming 15S larger polymer of subunits, different subunits interacting with each other. So these will come back as we cover 10 proteins, different types of 10 proteins. So you'll see them classified based on their sedimentation coefficient. Very common classification in literature. Here are some examples of your 7S. So soy, lupin, vicilin, indegramin, soy glycinin, canola persiferin. So these are some of the proteins that will come back as examples. Time's up. I didn't even start protein analysis. What? Okay. Wow. Great. You tired? Okay. What's that? You have another class?
Start at 5:30.
What class? Oh, so sad for you. Brittany, don't go away. I'm gonna stop recording.
No, I'm here.
Okay.